I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are the chief architect for this massive, globally distributed microservices environment.
Oh, wow. Okay, diving right in.
Yeah, right into the deep end. So you are managing thousands of containers, and they're spinning up and down by the second. You've got APIs talking to third-party vendors, legacy mainframes trying to, communicate with these bleeding-edge cloud instances.
Sounds like a typical Tuesday for most enterprise IT teams, honestly.
Right. And the environment isn't just growing, it's mutating. Code is being pushed to production multiple times a day. Now imagine trying to secure this entire digital ecosystem, protecting it from ransomware or data exfiltration. But, and here's the kicker, you don't actually have a map of what's running.
That is a completely terrifying scenario.
It is. Worse, you don't have a structured schedule for when or how you are going to test the security of these systems. You are essentially just sending your engineers out blindly into the server logs, hoping they just stumble across a critical vulnerability before a threat actor does.
Which is, frankly, a recipe for a catastrophic breach.
Exactly. It sounds completely untenable. But believe it or not, that is exactly what a modern enterprise operates like if it lacks a rigorous, mathematically sound IT audit schedule. It's just a massive, complex system left completely to the whims of chance.
It really is terrifying when you frame it that way, because without that structured map and without a disciplined schedule dictating when you examine specific coordinates on that map, you end up with massive blind spots.
Yeah, you could have your best people looking in totally the wrong places.
Precisely. You might have your most talented cybersecurity auditors spending, 6 months meticulously testing the access controls of some internal low-risk HR portal.
While the central database housing your customers' plaintext financial data hasn't been looked at in 4 years.
Exactly. The audit schedule is literally the only bridge that exists between the finite resources of an audit team and the theoretically infinite risk of the enterprise.
And that is exactly the dynamic we are unpacking today. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are going to walk you step by step through the actual mechanics of how this is done in the real world.
It's going to be a fascinating ride.
Our source material today is the ISACA IT Audit Framework. Most people just call it ITF. Specifically the 5th edition, we are zeroing in on Chapter 3 today.
Which is really the meat of the operational side of things.
It really is. Our mission for this deep dive is to put on our instructor hats and decode Performance Standard 1202. That lays down the mandatory laws of audit scheduling. And then we'll look at the corresponding Performance Guidelines 2202, which tell you how to actually build the thing.
We're going to take it one concept at a time, just moving sequentially through the framework.
And if you're wondering why you should invest your time in this, whether you are an IT auditor, an IT manager, or just someone fascinated by how massive digital organizations keep from collapsing, it's because understanding the scheduling process reveals the secret rhythm of enterprise risk management.
That is such a good way to put it, the secret rhythm. Because it strips away all the marketing jargon and shows you exactly how an organization objectively values its assets.
It shows you how a company anticipates danger, and most importantly, how it strategically deploys its defensive resources. This isn't just administrative calendar management. We're talking about organizational survival here.
Absolutely. So let's lay out the syllabus for where we are heading today.
Yes, let's give you the roadmap. We have 4 main territories to cover. First, we are diving into the mandatory rules, that is Standard 1202. These are the absolute non-negotiables. Second, we move into the blueprint phase.
Right, the practical guidelines for defining what is known as the audit universe.
Exactly, which is Guidelines 2202.1 and 2202.2. Third, we will transition into engagement planning in 2202.3, figuring out how to operationally prep for these audits. And finally, we're going to look at the modern twist.
Agile auditing.
Yes, agile auditing in 202.4. Because traditional auditing is annual, but the modern world moves way too fast for that.
It's a very logical progression built into the framework. It takes you from the foundational legalistic requirements into the theoretical mapping of the enterprise, down into the tactical deployment of teams, and then forces you to adapt the whole thing for the speed of modern cloud computing.
So let's jump right into Section 1, the mandatory rules, Performance Standard 1202. But before we get to the very first subpoint, we really need to establish some terminology for you.
The difference between a standard and a guideline. Right?
Yeah, the framework makes a very specific distinction there. For someone operating in the trenches of IT governance, what does the word standard actually obligate them to do?
That is a critical distinction, and it has immense professional and, honestly, sometimes legal implications. In the ITAF architecture, Guidelines are highly recommended practices. They are the how-to.
Okay, so guidelines are helpful suggestions.
Yes, but standards are mandatory. They represent the bedrock of professional credibility. When you read a standard in this document, it is not a suggestion. It's not a best practice you can just opt out of if you're short on time. It's a hard requirement.
So you can't just say, well, we were too busy this quarter.
Absolutely not. If you are an IT audit function that claims to operate in accordance with ISACA standards, which many boards of directors and external regulators strictly require, you absolutely must comply with the 1200 series. These standards dictate the minimum acceptable level of performance to ensure the audit is objective, reliable, and legally defensible.
Wow. Okay, so if an auditor fails to meet a standard, what happens?
Any findings or assurances they provide are fundamentally compromised. The whole audit gets thrown out the window, essentially.
Okay, keeping that strict, non-negotiable nature in mind, let's look at the first rule. Topic 1 is 1202.1, Strategic Audit Planning. The text states that practitioners must develop short and long-term audit schedules that are aligned with strategic objectives and the enterprise risk profile, and it explicitly requires governance approval.
That alignment piece is huge.
Right. But I read that, and my first thought is about corporate friction. Let's unpack this with an analogy. Say a company's strategic objective is to aggressively pivot to becoming an AI-driven service provider within 2 years. How does an audit schedule realistically align with a pivot that hasn't even fully happened yet?
That friction is exactly why this standard exists in the first place. In less mature organizations, you often see this massive disconnect between what the board wants to achieve and what the audit team is actually doing on the ground.
Like they're speaking two different languages.
Exactly. You'll have an enterprise aggressively pushing into cloud infrastructure and generative AI, but the internal audit team is still spending 40% of their annual hours doing physical walkthroughs of legacy data centers.
Just because that's what we did last year?
Yes. Standard 1202.1 legally forces the audit function to break that cyclical checklist mentality. The audit schedule has to act as a forward-looking strategic shield. It must constantly orient toward where the enterprise is vulnerable right now and where those vulnerabilities will emerge as those strategic objectives are executed.
It makes me think of managing a university curriculum or maybe a venture capital portfolio. You don't allocate your capital based on what industries were profitable 5 years ago. You allocate capital based on your thesis of where the market is going.
Right, where the highest concentration of risk and reward currently sits.
Yeah. So if the enterprise is betting its future on cloud-native architecture, your audit capital, which is highly specialized, very expensive engineering time, must be heavily invested in assessing cloud security protocols.
If your schedule doesn't reflect that bet, your audit function is effectively useless to the board.
And that ties directly into why governance approval is a mandatory part of this standard, right?
Precisely. Governance, which usually means the board of directors or executive audit committee, needs to look at this proposed schedule and formally sign off on it. They have to agree, yes, this specific deployment of our auditing resources perfectly reflects our understanding of the threats to our strategic goals.
It forces a conversation between the technical auditors and the business leaders.
Exactly. If the chief information security officer says the biggest risk is third-party vendor compromise, but the proposed schedule only allocates, say, 1 week to vendor management audits, the board has the obligation to challenge that schedule before approving it.
Okay, let's play devil's advocate for a second. Let's look at topic 2, which is 1202.2, enterprise-wide communication. The standard mandates that the approved schedule must be communicated enterprise-wide to ensure readiness and alignment.
A very important step.
I understand the theory of alignment. But practically speaking, think about this. If you tell a deeply disorganized, underperforming IT operations team that you are coming to audit their Active Directory in exactly 6 months, aren't you just giving them a 6-month head start to sweep all their bad practices under the rug?
Yeah, the classic ambush argument.
Right. How does a scheduled, heavily telegraphed audit actually catch systemic laziness or architectural flaws? Doesn't the element of surprise have value?
It's a very common question, but it relies on a fundamental misunderstanding of what a modern IT audit actually is. There is this persistent myth that an auditor is like a white glove inspector looking for dust on a windowsill, and if the auditee frantically cleans the house the night before, the auditor finds nothing.
But IT architecture doesn't work that way.
No, it doesn't. You cannot hide a fundamentally flawed system architecture in a week. If an IT team's practice for provisioning user access is entirely manual, undocumented, and bypasses the identity management system, they can't just fake an automated compliance system overnight.
They'd have to build a whole new system.
Exactly. Furthermore, an IT audit relies heavily on historical data. Auditors are pulling system logs, change management tickets, and server configurations from the past 12 months. An IT team cannot go back in time and fabricate a year's worth of compliant access logs.
And if they try to doctor the logs, that's a whole other massive problem.
Oh, absolutely. The manipulation of the logs itself becomes a massive, highly visible critical finding. It's fraud at that point.
So if the ambush doesn't actually yield better results, what does the enterprise-wide communication actually achieve functionally?
It achieves operational reality. Auditing is incredibly resource-intensive for the auditee. The IT engineers being audited have their normal day jobs, keeping the company's systems online. When an audit happens, those same engineers have to pull complex queries, sit for hours of interviews, gather documentation, walk auditors through these highly complex network topology diagrams.
That takes a ton of time.
It does. If you ambush them, they literally will not have the bandwidth to provide the necessary evidence. The audit will just grind to a halt due to a lack of resources. By communicating the schedule enterprise-wide, you are setting a cultural expectation of transparency.
You aren't giving them time to hide, you are giving them time to participate.
Exactly. You allow the business units to incorporate the audit into their own operational resource planning.
That reframes it completely for me. It turns the audit from an adversarial gotcha operation into a synchronized corporate hygiene exercise.
Well said.
But let's be real, what happens when reality punches that perfectly communicated, board-approved schedule in the mouth?
It always does.
The framework actually addresses this in Topic 3, 1202.3 Dynamic Scheduling. The standard states, and I quote, "Schedules must be updated to address unexpected events."
This is where the theoretical elegance of a long-term schedule collides with the chaotic reality of the technology sector.
Totally. Let's talk about a scenario. Say it's December. Your board has just approved a pristine 12-month audit schedule. Everyone is high-fiving. Then, in February, a massive zero-day vulnerability drops. Something like that Log4j vulnerability from a few years ago that was embedded in almost every Java-based application on the planet.
Oh, that was a nightmare for everyone.
Every security team is panicking. You cannot look at your board-approved schedule in that moment and say, well, it says here we are auditing the employee travel expense system this month, so we're just going to ignore the fact that our core servers might be currently bleeding data.
No, you absolutely cannot. If a new technology drops or a massive breach hits your industry globally, the schedule has to pivot instantly.
And standard 1202.3 makes that pivot a mandatory requirement, right?
Yeah.
Not just a good idea.
Yes. If an unexpected event instantly and fundamentally changes the enterprise risk profile, the schedule legally must adapt to reflect that new reality. Because, going back to 1202.1, the schedule must align with the risk profile. If the profile changes, the schedule must change to remain compliant with the framework. It forces this continuous feedback loop.
But this introduces a massive political and operational problem. Think about it. If your audit team pivots to jump onto this new burning Log4 risk, what happens to the audit you are legally mandated to perform on that travel expense system? It doesn't just evaporate.
Which brings us perfectly to Topic 4, 1202.4 Deferral of Audit Engagements.
Right. The standard says that deferred audits must be reassigned to ensure ongoing risk coverage.
It's a critical governance control mechanism. It prevents the audit schedule from silently deteriorating.
Because as you listening to this should realize, you can't just hit delete on an audit engagement because you ran out of time. It isn't a personal to-do list where you just cross things off.
No, every audit on that board-approved schedule was put there because a rigorous risk assessment identified a specific vulnerability that needed to be tested.
So if you defer that audit, you are making a conscious, documented decision to leave a known risk unexamined for an extended period.
That is a heavy organizational decision. It is the formal acceptance of risk. That is why the standard mandates reassignment. You are displacing the audit, not canceling it.
And because it's displaced, the governance bodies need to be brought back into the loop.
Exactly. If the chief audit executive decides to defer an audit on legacy database backups to deal with an emergency cloud migration review, the board of directors needs to formally acknowledge and approve that deferral. The board has to go on record saying, we accept the risk of operating our legacy backups without independent assurance for another 6 months.
It prevents audit teams from quietly dropping difficult or lower priority audits without executive oversight.
It keeps everything completely transparent at the highest level. Okay, that comprehensively covers Section 1. We've established the unyielding laws. The schedule must be strategic and aligned with risk. It must be communicated to enable operational participation. It must be dynamic enough to survive zero-day events. And any deferred audits must be formally reassigned with governance approval.
A solid foundation.
Now, we are going to pivot from the what must be done, the mandatory standards, to the how you actually do it, the guidelines.
Moving from the 1200 series into the 2200 series of the ITAF framework. The guidelines provide the methodologies, the structural recommendations, and the practical steps to build out the mechanisms that the standards demand.
Welcome to Section 2, the blueprint. We are digging into Guidelines 2202, specifically looking at the concept of the audit universe. This covers 2202 and 2202.2.
The audit universe. Yeah, Topic 5 is just setting the stage, 2202.1, Introduction to the Guidelines. It essentially says these guidelines exist to help practitioners build schedules based on the audit universe, accommodating both traditional and agile methodologies. But the real foundational concept drops in Topic 6, 2202.2.1, defining the audit universe.
It sounds like something out of a theoretical physics textbook, doesn't it?
It really does. The multiverse of the company. The text defines the audit universe as the complete, structured inventory of all auditable entities. This includes business processes, IT systems, applications, infrastructure, projects, compliance mandates, and third-party relationships. It is literally everything.
Everything under the sun.
But here's where it gets really interesting, and here's my question for you. How on earth do you map an audit universe when IT environments are so notoriously decentralized today?
That is the million-dollar question.
You have shadow IT everywhere. You have the marketing department spinning up AWS instances with a corporate credit card. Or a sales team adopting a new software-as-a-service CRM without telling the central IT security team. How does an auditor build a complete inventory when half the entities are actively hiding?
That is the defining struggle of the modern IT auditor. And it's exactly why building the audit universe is not a passive exercise of just, asking the CIO for a spreadsheet.
Because the CIO probably doesn't know about the marketing team's AWS account either.
Exactly. If you rely solely on what the IT department officially knows about, your universe is dangerously incomplete. Auditors have to look at procurement records, who is expensing cloud hosting fees. They have to look at network traffic analysis, what unrecognized IP addresses are communicating with our internal databases.
Oh, that's smart, following the money and the traffic.
They have to review legal contracts to identify new third-party vendor relationships. It is an active, investigative process.
Because if you don't know it exists, you can't assess its risk, and you certainly can't schedule an audit for it.
Right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the audit universe gives management total, comprehensive visibility. Without a complete universe, your entire enterprise risk assessment is mathematically flawed because the denominator of your equation is wrong.
Wow, yeah. You might think you have 100% of your critical risks mitigated, but you're only looking at 60% of your actual operational environment.
Exactly. It's a false sense of security.
Let's look at the anatomy of this inventory. Topic 7 is 202.2.2, Development of an Audit Universe Inventory. The guidelines specify that you can't just list the HR system and call it a day.
No, you need way more granularity than that.
You need a unique identifier, a detailed technical description, the specific business owner of the system, and the related risks. But the most critical piece of this guideline is how it dictates the rhythm of the schedule. We're talking about the frequency rule.
Yes. The correlation between the assessed risk of an entity and how frequently it must appear on the audit schedule.
The source material gives us a very explicit rule of thumb. High-risk entities should be audited annually. Medium-risk entities every 2 to 3 years. Low-risk entities every 3 to 5 years.
It seems straightforward on paper.
Right. But assigning these labels isn't arbitrary. I want you, the listener, to imagine you're sitting in front of a dashboard with 10,000 distinct auditable entities. How do you definitively decide what is high risk versus low risk, especially when everything is interconnected?
It requires an incredibly robust, objective risk assessment methodology. It cannot be based on a gut feeling. You have to evaluate multiple vectors: financial impact, regulatory fines, operational downtime, and reputational damage.
Can you give us a clear-cut example?
Sure. Think about a core payment processing gateway for an e-commerce giant. If that goes down, or if the encryption is breached, the company loses millions of dollars an hour, faces immediate regulatory action, and suffers massive reputational damage. That is objectively a high-risk entity. It goes on this schedule annually, without question.
Okay, that makes sense. On the flip side, let's look at a low-risk entity. Say you have an internal standalone server that hosts the company's historical archive of public press releases.
Right, the data is already public.
Exactly. If that server is compromised, there's no confidentiality breach. It doesn't connect to the financial systems. That is a low-risk entity. You schedule that for an audit every 4 or 5 years, mostly just to ensure the server hasn't been quietly repurposed as a botnet node.
Right, but what about the entities in the middle?
The messy middle.
The messy middle of medium risk is where audit teams really earn their paychecks.
Yeah.
And this is where interconnectedness becomes the ultimate wild card.
Walk us through that. How does interconnectedness change the math?
Let's look at a real-world parallel. Think about an enterprise's physical building HVAC system, the heating and air conditioning. Historically, an HVAC network might be classified as low or medium risk. It controls the temperature, not the data.
Right. Who cares if someone hacks the thermostat?
Yeah, exactly. But if that HVAC network is digitally connected to the broader corporate IT network without proper segmentation, which, by the way, is exactly what happened in the infamous Target data breach suddenly, a vulnerability in the HVAC system allows attackers to pivot directly into the point-of-sale network.
Wow. That completely changes the risk profile.
It elevates it entirely. An entity might seem medium risk in isolation, but if it serves as a lateral movement pathway to a high-risk system, its risk profile must be elevated. The risk assessment methodology must be dynamic enough to recognize those dependencies. The management tool for third-party contractors is audited every 12 months, while an internal training database is audited every 36 months.
That is fascinating. Which brings us to the actual construction of the timeline. Topic 8 covers 2002-2.2.3, developing the audit schedule, and 2002.2.4 dynamic adjustments. This is where you translate the static inventory into a 1 to 3 year plan, get it approved by governance, and then continuously review it.
The execution phase.
Now, I want to challenge this concept because there seems to be a massive paradox here.
Let's hear it.
The guideline explicitly tells you to build a 3-year plan and get it formally approved by the board of directors. Now, anyone who has worked in corporate governance knows that getting on a board's agenda, presenting a massive 3-year IT audit schedule, and getting formal approval takes months of agonizing preparation.
It is a very heavy lift.
It is. But then, the very next guideline says, be ready to dynamically adjust this constantly based on business changes. It feels fundamentally contradictory. Why subject the audit team to a heavy, bureaucratic, multi-month approval process for a 3-year document that everyone in the room knows will be functionally obsolete the minute a new AI regulation passes or a geopolitical event shifts the cyber threat landscape?
It is a paradox, I'll give you that.
Yeah.
But it is an entirely necessary one for maintaining corporate sanity.
Yeah.
Think of the 3-year approved plan not as a rigid contract, but as a strategic baseline.
A baseline, okay.
It represents the enterprise's steady-state intent. By approving it, the board is confirming that the audit function has a comprehensive mathematical understanding of the entire audit universe and a logical plan to cover it. The baseline is what proves you aren't just making things up as you go.
Okay, so it's the anchor. It proves we have a map.
Yeah.
But how does that help when you actually have to pivot?
The baseline is what allows you to calculate the precise cost of the pivot.
Ah.
When reality hits, let's say a sudden regulatory mandate requires an immediate massive audit of all algorithmic decision-making tools, you don't just throw the 3-year plan in the trash, you use it to manage the disruption. You go back to the audit committee and say, to address this new AI regulation immediately, we must invoke a dynamic adjustment. We will redirect 2,000 hours of audit resources.
And because you have the baseline, you know exactly what you are sacrificing to get those 2,000 hours.
Exactly. You say, according to our 3-year baseline, that means we must defer the planned audits of the legacy ERP system and the European data centers until next year. The baseline allows you to make adjustments in a controlled, governed, mathematically quantifiable manner, rather than just reacting with panic and losing track of what you are sacrificing.
That makes perfect sense. It's the difference between navigating a ship with a map and a compass and just wildly steering away from the loudest noise in the dark.
That's a great analogy.
Okay, so we've covered the mandatory rules and we've built our comprehensive map of the universe. Now let's move to Section 3. From theory to practice engagement planning. This is guideline 2202.3. Now that the universe is mapped and the schedule is built, how do we alert the planets that we are coming to visit?
This is where the macro-level multi-year strategy breaks down into micro-level boots-on-the-ground execution.
Topic 9 is 2202.3.1. Communicate the audit schedule. The core information here states that you must communicate tentative start dates, preliminary scope, and identify key stakeholders.
Notice the specific words there.
Yeah, that's what I want to dig into. Earlier, we established that enterprise-wide communication is good because it prevents the ambush. But why use language like tentative dates and preliminary scope? Why so non-committal? Why not give the IT operations team exact, locked-in dates and a final, rigid scope right out of the gate so they know exactly what to prepare for?
Because locking yourself into a rigid box months in advance is operational suicide in IT auditing. It comes down to resource balancing and preserving agility.
Give me a scenario.
If you publish a schedule in January stating that you will audit the cloud access control starting exactly on October 1st, and the scope will exclusively cover AWS IAM roles, you have trapped yourself. What happens if in September the company unexpectedly shifts 40% of its workload to Azure?
Your locked-in scope is now functionally relevant to the current risk landscape.
Exactly. So the preliminary scope is a placeholder. It's a conversation starter. Providing a preliminary scope tells the IT directors, sometime in Q3, we are going to look broadly at cloud governance. It gives them the context they need to start gathering the right personnel and basic documentation.
And then you narrow it down later.
Right. When the actual engagement planning begins closer to the execution date, the audit team will perform a micro-risk assessment of that specific area based on the absolute latest telemetry, and they will finalize the scope then.
You know, what does this all mean for you listening? I think of it less like an invitation and more like provisioning compute resources in a cloud environment.
Oh, I like where this is going.
When you reserve a block of time and resources on a server, you don't necessarily know the exact data workload you're going to run through it yet. You just know you need the processing power available in that specific window. Communicating tentative dates and preliminary scopes is essentially resource reservation for human capital.
Yes, that is spot on.
You are telling the IT stakeholders, we need to reserve a block of your team's processing power in Q4. We will define the exact workload when we get closer, but block the capacity now so the network doesn't crash when we initiate the process.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. It respects the auditee's operational capacity while preserving the auditor's flexibility to finalize the exact testing parameters based on the most current threat intelligence.
All right, we have arrived at the final section of our deep dive. We've talked extensively about multi-year plans, annual risk frequencies, and yearly schedules. But we all know that the modern digital ecosystem, especially for companies operating in software development or cloud-native environments, moves way too fast for a strictly annual mindset.
Far too fast.
If your engineering team is pushing code to production 20 times a day, an audit schedule built on a 12-month cycle is effectively examining ancient history. That brings us to Section 4. The modern twist agile auditing. This is guideline 202.4.
This is where the ISACA framework proves its relevance to the modern technological landscape. Traditional auditing is cyclical, right? It assumes a relatively stable environment where systems look mostly the same in December as they did in January.
Which is almost never the case anymore.
Exactly. In an enterprise heavily invested in continuous integration and continuous deployment CI/CD, the environment is constantly shifting. A risk that didn't even exist in Q1 could become a critical vulnerability by Q2. You cannot wait for an annual planning retreat to address it.
Topic 10 is 202.4.1 Agile Auditing Scheduling Considerations. The core concept here is that evolving risks require highly adaptive approaches. Instead of relying solely on a rigid, locked-in annual schedule, the guideline introduces the concept of a dynamic backlog.
If you are familiar with software development methodologies, specifically the Agile framework, you will instantly recognize this architecture.
Let's really dissect this because the source text provides a very specific three-quarter example of how an Agile audit schedule is practically executed. I want to walk through this as if we are looking at an audit team's Kanban board.
Let's do it.
In quarter one, the text says, Cybersecurity controls review begins with a 2-sprint cycle focused on identity and access management, followed by incident response testing. Let's break down Q1. They aren't saying, we are doing a massive 6-month waterfall cybersecurity audit. They are using sprints.
Sprints are short, strictly time-boxed bursts of intense, hyper-focused work, usually 2 to 4 weeks long. Instead of trying to audit the entire cybersecurity apparatus at once, they isolate a specific high-risk component, identity and access management, or IAM.
How does a two-sprint cycle on IAM actually play out functionally? Why is it better than a traditional audit?
In a traditional audit, the team might spend 2 months just gathering evidence for all cybersecurity domains before testing anything. In an agile sprint, the team focuses exclusively on IAM. During Sprint 1, they might strictly look for open Active Directory accounts.
Accounts of employees who have left the company but whose access was never revoked.
Exactly. They write scripts, query the system, find the anomalies, and deliver those findings immediately to IT to be patched. In Sprint 2, they might focus purely on overprivileged service accounts. They find the risk, report the risk, and deliver value in weeks, not months.
And once that IAM value is delivered, the sprint ends, and they immediately pivot to the next highest priority on the board, which the example states is incident response testing.
It is iterative, rapid, and continuously delivers actionable intelligence.
Now let's look at how this handles disruption. Quarter 2, the example says, cloud governance audit is tentatively scheduled, but may be reprioritized if new privacy regulations emerge.
This captures the very essence of agile scheduling. They have a planned objective for Q2 cloud governance, but they explicitly establish the trigger condition that will cause them to abandon that plan: new privacy regulations.
In a traditional annual schedule, if a major new data privacy regulation emerged in April, the audit team might look at their rigid schedule and say, well, we don't have the budget or the hours scheduled to look at privacy compliance until next year's planning cycle. It will have to wait.
Which is a massive failure of risk management. In the Agile model, the emergence of that new regulation triggers an immediate reassessment of the backlog. The audit leadership looks at the board, assesses the new regulatory risk against the planned cloud governance audit, and makes a real-time decision.
So cloud governance gets bumped down the backlog.
Yes, and privacy compliance is instantly pulled into the next active sprint. The resources are dynamically reallocated to the point of highest friction.
And finally, let's look at quarter 3, the text notes. Data protection audits remain in the backlog, scheduling decisions based on updated risk assessments and priorities.
Notice how Q3 isn't even scheduled. It is just a concept sitting in the backlog.
They know it's important, but they aren't committing yet.
The audit team knows data protection is critical. It exists in the audit universe, but they refuse to prematurely commit resources to it. They wait until they are closer to Q3, run an updated real-time risk assessment, and then decide if data protection is still the highest priority or if something else has superseded it.
By utilizing this combination of short sprints and a fluid backlog, it ensures that the highly expensive, highly skilled audit team is always, without fail, working on the absolute highest priority risk at any given moment.
Rather than executing against a stale mandate decided by a committee 11 months ago.
It is a profound shift in operational philosophy.
It really is. It aligns the speed of assurance with the speed of business.
Let's take a step back and summarize the incredible journey we've just taken through Chapter 3 of the ITAF. We started with the unyielding, legally binding rules of Standard 1202. We established that your schedule must be strategically aligned with the enterprise risk profile. It must be communicated enterprise-wide to allow for resource reservation. It must be dynamically adjustable to survive reality. And any deferred audits must be formally accepted by governance.
The bedrock of credibility.
From there, we dove into the blueprint of Guidelines 2202. We talked about the monumental task of mapping the audit universe, hunting down shadow IT, and mathematically calculating risk frequencies to decide what gets audited annually versus every 5 years.
The messy middle and all those interconnected systems.
We discussed the operational psychology of engagement planning with tentative scopes. And finally, we brought the entire framework into the cutting-edge present with agile auditing, trading rigid 12-month calendars for dynamic backlogs and 2-week sprints.
When you synthesize all of these components, the core takeaway for you, listening to this, is that IT audit scheduling is absolutely not administrative busywork. It is not an exercise in filling out spreadsheets just to keep regulators happy.
It is the strategic mathematical heartbeat of enterprise security.
A meticulously designed schedule is the only mechanism that ensures the right questions are asked by the right technical experts at the exact moment of maximum vulnerability. It is the complex machinery that translates the abstract theoretical concept of enterprise risk into actionable, deployed defense.
I couldn't agree more. It's the connective tissue of security. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. We just spent a significant amount of time exploring this evolution from rigid annual schedules to dynamic, agile backlogs. We are constantly shrinking the time frame of planning to keep up with the accelerating speed of risk.
Faster and faster.
But if enterprise technology, things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, autonomous code deployment, and self-healing cloud environments continues to evolve and mutate by the millisecond, will we eventually reach a horizon where the very concept of an audit schedule disappears entirely?
Oh, that's a deep question.
If internal systems and AI agents can continuously, autonomously probe their own vulnerabilities, test their own access controls, and report on their own control effectiveness in real time, 24 hours a day, does the agile backlog eventually just become continuous autonomous machine auditing? Is the ultimate destination of agile scheduling simply no schedule at all?
It is a fascinating horizon to consider. If the architecture is autonomously auditing itself in real time, what is left for the human auditor to schedule? Perhaps the only item left on the schedule will be the audit of the AI that is conducting the continuous audits. It's a paradigm shift that is approaching much faster than the industry is currently prepared for.
That is certainly something to keep you thinking until we meet again. Thank you so much for joining us for this incredibly deep dive into decoding IT audit scheduling. We hope you've enjoyed unpacking the mechanics of the ITF with us. Stay curious, keep dissecting those complex systems, and we will see you on the next deep dive.
Thank you for your time, and we look forward to exploring the next massive topic with you.